If you observe any group of people long enough, you'll start to notice a very familiar pattern. There are always a few people who talk the most. They are the ones who tell the most stories, react the fastest, always have an opinion about everything, and because they take up more communication space, people begin to unconsciously believe that they are the center of the situation. In many meetings, in many friend groups, in many organizations, the person who talks the most is often seen as the most influential. But if you observe a little more closely, you'll notice something interesting. The person who talks the most is rarely the one who understands the situation the most. The issue comes from a very common psychological illusion. The human brain tends to confuse presence with power. Who appears more often, who speaks more often, who takes up more space. Our brains automatically conclude that that person must be more important. But the reality of social power works through a completely different mechanism. Every time you speak, you're doing more than just communicating. You're revealing data. You reveal how you think, what makes you react, what makes you uncomfortable, what makes you proud, what makes you insecure. Every sentence is like a small piece of the psychological map inside you. And if someone is patient enough to observe, after only a short time, they can read you very clearly. Meanwhile, the quiet person is often doing the opposite. They don't rush to share their opinions. They don't react immediately. They don't reveal all their thoughts. This creates something extremely important in any power system: information asymmetry, an imbalance of information. This principle appears everywhere: in business, in politics, in strategy, in negotiation. The person who knows more always has the advantage. But what's interesting is that this advantage doesn't always come from learning more. Sometimes it simply comes from speaking less. Think about a meeting. One person keeps talking about their opinions, their strategy, their concerns. After 10 minutes, everyone in the room almost completely understands how that person thinks. But there's another person in the room. This person barely says anything. They just listen. They observe. They note everyone's reactions. After 10 minutes, that person understands almost everyone in the room, while no one really understands them. This is when power begins to shift. The talkative person may control the conversation, but the observer is collecting a map of the entire room. And in any strategic game, the person with the map always has the advantage. There's a reason skilled interrogators usually speak very little. A reason great negotiators are rarely the ones who talk the most. And a reason many powerful leaders are not the loudest person in the room. They understand a simple rule: the more you talk, the easier you are to predict. The easier you are to predict, the easier you are to control. But silence creates the opposite effect. Silence creates ambiguity. And when a person is hard to read, people begin to become more cautious. They start observing themselves. They'd begin adjusting their behavior, not because the quiet person has done anything special, but because uncertainty always creates power. This explains an interesting paradox. In many rooms, the person with real power is not the one who talks the most. It's the person who makes everyone pay attention when they finally speak. Because when someone rarely speaks, every word they say begins to carry weight. And this is something most of society doesn't realize. Talking a lot can create presence, but silence used correctly creates advantage. The person who talks the most controls the conversation, but the quiet person controls the information. There's something very few people realize about human communication. We don't just talk to share. We talk to reduce psychological tension. And one of the biggest sources of tension in communication is silence. Imagine a simple situation. You say something, and the person doesn't react immediately. No nod, no disagreement, no smile, just looking at you. Within the first few seconds, Your brain starts running through a series of questions. Did I say something wrong? What are they thinking? Do they agree? Why aren't they saying anything? Just a few seconds of silence, and the mind starts creating scenarios. This is because the human brain hates social gaps. In communication psychology, this is called the social tension gap, a space in interaction that learns how to feel uncomfortable. And the natural human instinct is to fill that gap with words. That's why, in many conversations, the person who talks the most isn't necessarily the one who has more to say. It's the one who can't tolerate silence. They need to break it. They need to fill it. And in the process, they often say more than necessary. You can see this very clearly in negotiations. One person makes an offer. The other person just stays silent. 5 seconds pass. 10 seconds pass. Then the first person starts talking again. We can be a little flexible. Or, actually, our budget is somewhat limited. Just because of the silence, they begin to concede on their own. The same thing happens in normal conversations. You ask a simple question. The other person answers. If you react immediately, the conversation stops there. But if you just look at them and stay silent for a few more seconds, very often, they will keep talking. They will add more explanations, reveal more details, sometimes say things they didn't intend to say. This is why skilled observers don't rush to respond. They understand that every moment of silence is an opportunity to collect data. Not data from the first answer, but from what people say afterward. Because the first answer is often the social answer, but the second answer is often the real one. In psychological interrogation, this is a very well-known technique. The investigator asks a question. The person answers. Then the investigator says nothing, just watches. No reaction, no interruption, just allowing the silence to exist. And within that silence, the other person starts to feel pressure. They begin talking more, then more, until they reveal more than they originally intended. But the interesting thing is, you don't need to be an interrogator to see this. You just need to observe everyday life, in a group of friends, in a meeting, in a new encounter. The quiet person is often the one who hears the most, not because they ask more questions, but because they create space for others to speak. And gradually, something interesting happens. People begin revealing themselves around you, not because you force them, but because they feel the need to talk, while you only need to listen. This is one of the greatest advantages of silence. The person who talks a lot has to search for information. The quiet person is often given information, and over time, this creates a very large gap. You begin to understand how people think, what makes them insecure, what makes them proud, what makes them easy to manipulate, while they know very little about you. That's when real power begins to form. Not loud power, not dominating power, but the power of perception. You don't need to control others. You only need to understand them better than they understand you. And when that happens, social interactions begin to change. You no longer react emotionally. You begin to see motives, behavior patterns, what's happening beneath the words, things that people who talk too much usually never have time to notice. The person who talks a lot tries to express themselves, but the quiet person makes others reveal themselves. But silence doesn't just make others talk more. It creates an even stronger psychological effect. When someone is hard to read, our brain starts imagining things about them. And sometimes, what we imagine is more powerful than anything they could actually say. There's an interesting paradox in how people judge others. When someone talks a lot, we don't have to imagine anything about them. We've already seen almost everything. We know what they think, what they believe, how they react, how much they understand. In other words, they have already defined themselves for us. But when someone is hard to read, our brain starts doing something very interesting. It begins filling in the gaps with assumptions. This is a psychological mechanism called psychological projection. When information is incomplete, The human brain automatically creates a story to complete the picture. Here's a very simple example. You meet two people. The first person talks a lot about themselves, what they do, what they think, what they're good at. After 10 minutes, you already have a pretty clear picture of them, and that picture is usually quite ordinary. But the second person is different. They talk less. They listen more. They don't rush to share their opinions. After a while, your brain starts wondering, what are they thinking? How are they judging me? Do they see something I don't see? And in that gap of information, you start imagining things about them. Some people begin to think, this person must be very intelligent. Some people think, this person is probably observing everything. Some even think, this person probably has more power than I do. Not because the quiet person has done anything special, but because ambiguity activates imagination. And this is where a very interesting social rule appears. In many cases, perception matters more than reality. If people believe you understand more, they will treat you as if you understand more. If people believe you have influence, they will treat you as if you have influence. Perception creates a feedback loop. This is why in many environments of power, people with high status often don't talk too much. They don't need to. They understand that every time you over-explain, you're doing two things. You reduce ambiguity, and when ambiguity disappears, the aura disappears too. Think about people who are truly confident. They rarely talk excessively to prove themselves. They don't try to explain every decision. They don't rush to argue just to win, not because they don't have opinions, but because they understand something very simple. People with real value don't need to constantly prove their value. When someone is always trying to prove themselves, other people's brains start sensing the opposite. They sense insecurity. But when someone doesn't rush to prove anything, other people start wondering, what do they know that I don't? This is the origin of something we often call presence. Some people walk into a room, and they don't need to do anything special, yet people still notice them. Not because they are loud, but because they are not. They're not trying to be noticed. Their calmness creates a kind of mystery, and inside that mystery, other people begin projecting respect. This doesn't mean silence is some kind of manipulation. It simply reflects a basic truth about human psychology. People fear what they don't fully understand, and they often respect what they cannot easily read. But this is also where many people completely misunderstand the idea. Not every kind of silence creates attraction. Not every quiet person has an aura. In reality, there are two very different kinds of silence. One makes you invisible. The other makes you unpredictable, and only one of them creates power. The person who talks a lot defines themselves, but the person who is hard to read makes others imagine who they are. So the real question, and isn't it, does silence create power? The real question is, are you silent because you feel powerless, or silent because you're observing? Because from the outside, those two things look the same, but internally, they are completely different states. At this point, there's a very dangerous misunderstanding that needs to be clarified. Not every kind of silence is strength. In fact, most silence in the world does not come from power. It comes from fear. There's a very familiar type of silence. It happens when someone doesn't dare to speak their opinion, is afraid of being judged, is afraid of being opposed, is afraid of making others uncomfortable. They stay quiet because they think, if I say this, it might cause problems. If I say this, people might not like me. If I say this, I might look stupid. So they choose to say nothing. But this kind of silence does not create power. It creates invisibility, because when someone is silent out of fear, their body language reveals it. Hesitant eye contact, slow reactions, withdrawn energy. Other people may not understand exactly what's happening, but they feel the lack of confidence. And in social systems, lack of confidence rarely creates influence. But there is another kind of silence entirely, the silence of control. This person isn't silent because they're afraid to speak. They're silent because they don't need to speak. You can recognize this type of person quite easily. They don't rush to react. When someone says something controversial, they don't jump into the argument immediately. They observe, they listen, they watch how people in the room react. They understand the context before giving an opinion. And then, when they do speak, they speak very little. But what they say, they go straight to the most important point. There's a very simple reason for this. People who react quickly are people who respond more slowly are usually processing cognitively. One person is trying to win the argument. The other is trying to understand the entire situation. And over time, people start noticing this difference. They begin to realize that some people talk a lot, but don't really change anything, while others speak very little. But every time they speak, the conversation shifts. This is where silence starts to gain weight. If someone talks constantly, their words become background noise. But if someone rarely speaks, every word becomes a signal. And the human brain is designed to pay attention to signals. You can see this very clearly in working groups. Some people always speak up. They have opinions about everything. But after a while, people begin to tune them out. They're still talking, but no one is really listening. Then there's another person. This person rarely speaks. But when they begin talking, the whole room usually goes quiet. Not because they were told to, but because everyone has learned something. If this person speaks, there's probably something worth hearing. This is the difference between the silence of insecurity and the silence of selectiveness. One side doesn't speak because they're afraid. The other doesn't speak because they don't need to say everything. And over time, this selectiveness creates a very interesting effect. It makes people start adjusting their behavior around you. They speak more carefully. They think before they talk. Not because you impose authority, but because your calm presence makes people feel that you're seeing more than you're saying. But this is where the real power begins. Because when you are not pulled into every argument, when you don't react to every social stimulus, you gain an advantage that very few people notice. You start seeing patterns in human behavior. And once you start seeing patterns, you are no longer trapped in the game. You start seeing the rules of the game. Silence is not power, but the ability to choose when to speak and when to observe. That is power. And this is where things become even more interesting. Because people who speak less often develop a skill that most of society never has time to develop. A skill that is almost like a superpower in the modern world. The ability to see patterns in human behavior. And once you start seeing those patterns, you will never look at society the same way again. There's something most people don't realize about attention. It's a limited resource. In every moment, the brain can only focus on a few things, and this creates a huge difference between two types of people. Those who are constantly busy expressing themselves, and those who spend most of their time observing others. When you're speaking, a large portion of your cognitive energy goes into choosing your words, reacting to other people, managing the image you present. You're on the stage. But when you're silent, you're no longer on the stage. You're in the audience, and from the audience, you can see the entire field. This is why people who observe more often start noticing things others miss. They notice who is trying to impress whom, who is seeking approval, who is trying to appear more confident than they actually feel, who is saying something just to protect their ego. At first, These things look like small details, a glance, a moment of hesitation, a subtle change in tone. But when you observe long enough, those small details begin to connect, and they form patterns. You start realizing that people are not as random as we think. A lot of their behavior repeats in very predictable patterns. Some people always try to be the smartest person in the room. Some always try to be the funniest. Some always try to avoid conflict. Some always feel the need to win every argument. And when you start seeing those patterns, something interesting happens. You begin to understand that much of social behavior is not really about truth. It's about status, ego, insecurity. A person argues not because they want to find what's right, but because they want to protect their image. Someone brags not because they're confident, but because they're afraid of being seen as not good enough. Someone criticizes others not because they hate them, but because it makes them feel slightly superior. Once you start seeing these motivations, you stop reacting to surface-level words. You start seeing the intentions behind them. And when you see the intentions, many social games become predictable. For example, someone tries to provoke you. If you only focus on their words, you might react emotionally. But if you see the pattern, you realize they're trying to do something very simple. They're trying to pull you into their game. And once you realize that, you suddenly have a choice you didn't have before. You can choose not to play. This is where silence starts to become a very different kind of power. Not the power to control others, but the power not to be controlled by them. In a world where everyone reacts quickly, slowing down becomes an advantage. In a world where everyone is constantly talking, the ability to listen becomes an advantage. And in a world where people get pulled into each other's emotions, the ability to calmly observe becomes a form of power. You begin to realize that you don't have to win every argument. You don't have to correct everyone. You don't have to react to everything, because most social situations are not battles that need to be won. They're patterns that need to be understood. And once you understand the pattern, you no longer feel threatened by other people's behavior. You see it, you understand it, and you decide whether to engage or not. This is the real advantage of observers. It's not that they're more mysterious. It's not that they're smarter. It's that they spend more time watching how the world actually works. Reactors respond to behavior. Observers see the pattern behind the behavior. And once you see the pattern, you stop getting pulled into the game. But there's something very few people talk about when it comes to this advantage. Seeing too much is not always comfortable. Because when you begin to understand people's real motivations, part of the social world starts to lose its innocence. And that's the price of observation. There's something rarely mentioned about observation. It doesn't just bring advantages, it also brings a cost. When you start seeing patterns in human behavior, part of the social world begins to change. Things that once surprised you start becoming predictable. You begin to realize that many arguments are not really about truth. They're about ego. You start noticing that many people don't say what they truly think. They say what protects their image. You begin to see that many actions that look like confidence are actually driven by insecurity. And when you see this enough times, something strange happens. You become less impressed by appearances, the performances, the loud statements, the strong declarations. They no longer carry the same weight, because you start asking yourself, what is actually happening behind this? But this awareness also has a darker side. When you see the motivations behind behavior, some of the social innocence begins to disappear. You start realizing that not every smile is sincere. Not every compliment is genuine. Not every conversation is as simple as it appears. Sometimes this can make you feel distant, not because you hate people, but because you start seeing layers of motivation you never noticed before. You see competition. You see insecurity. You see subtle attempts to raise status, things you might have overlooked in the past. This is the cost of seeing too much. Clarity often removes illusion, and sometimes those illusions are what make the social world feel lighter. But this is also where another kind of power appears. Once you see these dynamics, you're no longer easily pulled into them. A provocation no longer drags you into an immediate reaction. Someone trying to prove themselves no longer makes you feel the need to compete. Someone trying to manipulate your emotions no longer controls your reaction the way they once could. Not because you've become cold, but because you begin to understand that much of social behavior is not really about you. It's about what's happening inside other people. When someone tries to make you uncomfortable, it often says more about their insecurity than about your worth. When someone argues just to win, it usually says more about their need for validation than about the truth of the issue. And once you start seeing that, you gain a new kind of freedom. The freedom not to react to everything. The freedom not to prove yourself in every situation. The freedom not to win every social game. This is one of the deepest reasons why people who observe a lot often become calmer over time, not because they have fewer emotions, but because they better understand what is worth reacting to. In a world where everyone is constantly reacting, calmness begins to look like power, not dominating power, but the power of self-control. And when you reach this point, you start realizing that the real power of silence is not about making others curious. It's about no longer being pulled by everything around you. When you understand people deeply enough, you no longer need to control them. You simply stop letting them control your reactions. And this is where the entire idea of this video comes together. Because the real power of quiet people is not that they are more mysterious, not that they are more dangerous. It's that they develop a skill most of the world has never learned. The ability to remain still while everyone else is reacting. And in many situations, that is the most powerful form of power. After everything we've just talked about, there's a very interesting truth about power. Most people think power is the ability to control others, control the conversation, control the situation, control what people think about you. But when you observe long enough, you begin to realize that kind of power is very fragile because it depends on other people's reactions. If you need to win every argument, your power depends on whether other people argue. If you need to prove yourself, your power depends on whether others doubt you. If you need to control how others see you, you're living in a system where your power always depends on their eyes. But people who spend more time observing often discover a different kind of power, a kind of power that is less dramatic, but far more stable. It's the ability to understand a situation before reacting, see the motivations behind behavior, not get pulled into every social battle. In other words, it's the ability to keep control of yourself. In many social situations, the person who loses power the fastest is not the weakest person. It's the one who reacts the fastest, the person who is easily provoked, the person who feels the need to prove themselves. The person who cannot tolerate being misunderstood. The person who cannot tolerate being challenged. Those reactions don't just reveal emotions, they reveal vulnerabilities. And in any system of power, the most predictable person is usually the easiest to control. Quiet people often develop a very different advantage, not because they're trying to appear mysterious, but because they're used to observing before reacting. They don't rush to explain. They don't rush to prove themselves. They don't rush to defend their ego. This creates a very particular kind of presence, not the presence of dominance, but the presence of stability. In a room full of quick reactions, the calm person often becomes the anchor. People may not realize it immediately, but they sense that this person is not easily pulled around. And over time, that creates a very different kind of respect. Not respect because you speak the loudest, not respect because you impress the most, but respect because you don't need to impress. This is where many people begin to misunderstand themselves. If you are a quiet person, you may have thought before that you're not interesting enough, you're not strong enough, you're not confident enough. But sometimes, your difference is not a weakness, It's simply a different way of processing the world. While many people are busy reacting to everything, you are observing. While many people try to prove themselves, you are understanding the context. While many people get pulled into status games, you are seeing how the game actually works. And once you see the game, you no longer have to play every round. You can choose when to participate. You can choose when to stay silent. You can choose what is actually worth responding to. This is a kind of power that very few people talk about. Not the power of controlling others, but the power of not being easily controlled. In a world where everyone is constantly talking, silence begins to become rare. In a world where everyone is constantly reacting, calmness begins to become powerful. And in a world where everyone is trying to prove themselves, the person who does not need to prove anything often becomes the most unpredictable. So if you are the kind of person who observes more than they speak, thinks before reacting, doesn't feel the need to talk in every situation, you may not be weak. You may simply be developing a skill that most of the world has never learned. The strongest person in the room is not the one who talks the most, but the one who is the hardest to provoke. And when you understand this, your silence is no longer empty. It becomes a choice, a space to observe, a space to understand, and sometimes a kind of power that very few people in the room truly recognize.